Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yes.
Probably the most infamous Tennessean who fought in the Civil War. Because I think he's such an important character. And outside of Tennessee, not all that many people know about him. And I think if you don't know about him, you can't understand the Civil War. And you also can't understand what happens afterward with Reconstruction and with the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
So here's the basic
So who is
short
this guy?
story. Who is this guy? And why is there a Confederate battle
Is that
flag
the statue
behind
of him right there? Well, no, it's like a girl on a horse.
That is literally the ugliest statue of him ever, though it's recently
Click on that.
it's been moved. It's
Holy shit! What the?
it is the most ridiculous
That's
statue.
terrible.
It's
like
near Nashville.
It's like they couldn't afford the professional.
I mean, there's
Oh
so
my
many
God.
there's so many other reasons why this is the worst statue of all time, like historical reasons. But
I mean, it's-
aesthetically, visually, it makes you want to barf.
It's not even like a proportional human. Like, look at the size of his head.
So my students actually told me recently that the statue is gone. Like, it used to be very visible on the interstate driving near Nashville. Someone had painted it hot pink recently. The last that
there
I
it
saw.
is.
There it is. Yeah. But from what I've heard, that statue is no longer there. I can't confirm that personally because I don't drive around Nashville all that much. But
What did
I
they
think
write
it's
on
gone.
Oh,
Zoom in.
I
Oh, you can't zoom.
Yeah.
No, it won't let me.
Oh man.
So
It
here's
says
the deal.
monster. No, it says monster.
Oh,
Huh?
monster.
Monster
Okay.
down the legs.
They really nailed it with Monster. So who is this guy? Who's Nathan Bedford Forrest?
Right.
And when I tell you the story, it's going to blow your mind, especially the kind of post, the later parts of the story. So Nathan Bedford Forrest is from Tennessee, and he's born into pretty humble circumstances. He's not a super rich guy, but he has this astronomical rise to wealth and fame through his profession, through what he does for a living. And what does he do for a living? He's a slave trader. Right? He is, in fact, the most profitable slave trader in the city of Memphis before the Civil War.
So
And
he's
is
like a
major
middleman?
He's a guy like auctioning off, like selling human beings, right? Like
Okay.
he's like, no one is profiting more from the institution of slavery than Nathan Bedford Forrest.
So-
Like, he's out there. He owns people. He's kind of a middleman, right? I
So
mean,
if he grew up in humble beginnings, how did he get to own all these slaves?
through hard work, if you can call it that, in this awful profession. But he builds a sort of empire. He finds himself, speculating and gaining more wealth through human property that he makes. I think he's earning about $100,000 a year by 1850s dollars, which is a shitload of money, right?
So
he's a
relative to
millionaire.
today. Oh no,
Multi-million.
100. Oh, so
He's a multi-millionaire
Oh, wow.
in 1850s Memphis.
this might be a stupid question, but relative to today, what was the cost of a slave?
Let me see. I want to say, and I have to check back on the numbers here, that would probably be about 1,000. You know what? I mean, I can't pull the statistic up, but they're expensive, right?
We're going to ask Reddit here.
Okay, so about
There.
How much did slaves in America cost in today's money? And the real price of a slave in 1850 is around $12,000 in today's money. And the net earnings of owning a single slave is around $82,000.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily trust Reddit
Right.
as our first source.
Damn
here.
it.
But here's the deal. I mean, the whole system is so toxic, right? I mean, how do you possibly quantify a human being's worth?
Yeah, this Quora thing says generally around 500 for a young adult male and 1,000 for what? I can't see it now. I made it too small.
So listen to this. This is really fascinating. At the eve of the Civil War, the value of enslaved people was the single greatest piece of wealth in the South. Like much more than land, much more than cotton. Most of the planters, like the aristocracy in the South, most of their wealth lay in enslaved people, which means that by 1865, when that institution is gone and all that money disappears, the South gets enormously much poorer as a result, because like the amount of property, quote unquote, just disappeared.
Right.
So buying enslaved people, it was not cheap in that you needed to have money and resources, which is why Nathan Bedford Forrest is earning so much money selling people. Really, he's selling people primarily from the eastern seaboard, from old slaveholding states like Virginia, like North Carolina, toward the kind of boom zones of the South, which is Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, like places that have been recently settled. You know the phrase being sold down the river, like it's kind of a bad thing happening to you?
Yeah.
That's literally a reference to enslaved people being sold from the eastern parts of the South into the kind of southwestern parts of the South, because that's where all the money, that's where all the cotton, that's where all the boom is going on. So someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, they're making money transferring human beings, enslaved human beings, from the kind of old core of slavery in Virginia to the new kind of glowing center
In the
of-
West.
Yeah, in places like the Mississippi Delta,
So
like
if
in
you're
Louisiana.
if you're a slave owner in like Tennessee or Georgia or something like that, and you got a lot of slaves, you would essentially, so assuming that they bought them for a price a couple years ago, they would say, okay, I have too many, I'll sell them for a profit.
Yeah, the value as this toxic market, quantified, was far higher in the Mississippi Delta than in Eastern Virginia.
Okay.
Right, or Eastern North Carolina.
Okay.
So that's how Forrest is making his money, right?
Wow.
He is actively profiting from the forced relocation, right? Breaking up of families, the tearing apart of people's lives, to siphon them, selling them down the river, quite literally, to the west. He became this really famous and rich guy. So when the Civil War breaks out, no one at all was shocked. What side is he going to pick, right?
Right.
Like, guy who makes his entire living off of the practice of slavery, of course
Right.
he's going to be a fervent supporter of the Confederacy, which he is. And he joins the military, and he rises in the ranking of the military, so that he is a commander. I can't remember what his precise title was.
You can probably find it, Steve.
Yeah, I'm sure he can dig it up. But he's a cavalry officer in the.
Who's the dude?
Forrest.
This is Nathan Bedford Forrest
Oh,
again.
Nathan.
What was his full title in the Confederacy? I'm blanking on it at the moment.
Nathan Bedford
Confederate
Forrest.
general.
Is he a general?
Will Wikipedia tell us the truth about him?
He's a high up guy. I'll tell you that much.
Okay.
Confederate Army general. Oh, well, he'll have his thingy down here. Specifically,
Yeah,
He
Lieutenant
was a
General.
Freemason.
Lieutenant
General. So one of the most infamous moments in the Civil War involves this guy. Okay, so it's in 1864, I want to say. He is commanded to take this fort in western Tennessee that's on the banks of the Mississippi River called Fort Pillow. And Fort Pillow was one of these forts that the U.S. Army had taken really early on in the war, because the U.S. tries to get control of the Mississippi River as soon as possible, because they want to basically choke off the South. Like they've got
Right.
a blockade on the Atlantic, and they want to choke them from the western side by gaining control of the river, which they do quite early on. But their control of that is weakening by 1864. And Forrest is given the task of retaking this fort in western Tennessee, pretty close to Memphis, called Fort Pillow. And he's eager to do this because he knows that the U.S. soldiers who are holding this fort at Fort Pillow are in large part African American, right? That there's hundreds of U.S. colored troops who are holding this fort, right? And he, his relationship with black people. He's made his living selling their literal bodies, right? So he has a tremendous grudge against any black person who would A, defy the Confederacy, and B, try to destroy the Confederacy by joining the U.S. Army. So when he attacks this fort in 1864, the U.S. he has the upper hand in the battle, right? It's pretty obvious that the Confederate cavalry is going to take this fort, and they do. The U.S. troops inside begin surrendering, expecting to be spared, right? Expecting to become prisoners.
Right.
But Forrest wants to send a message. Right? He wants to send a message by executing nearly all of the African American troops fighting in resisting the Confederacy in that fort. So this becomes not just the Battle of Fort Pillow; it's the massacre of Fort Pillow, where I think about 150 or so black troops are shot execution style by Forrest and his men. Right? People who are surrendering. Right? People like the battle is over, and quote, Forrest says this again. I'm not making this stuff up. He says the battlefield has to be dyed with the blood, of black soldiers to prove that black people can't resist the Confederacy or whatever. So he wants to send a message. Like he's engaging in terrorism essentially, right? He wants to send his violent message,
Of course.
so that there's going to be ripple waves of fear against any other black Southerners who would consider joining the U.S. Army. It backfires against him, though, right? Because people do remember Fort Pillow, but they do so as kind of a battle call to get black Southerners to join the army rather than that. Like, you heard, remember the Alamo, right? Remember Fort Pillow was something you would hear both in northern and southern black communities as a rationale to join the army.
It was a recruiting mechanism.
Exactly, right? So Forrest wanted the opposite. Now, what about Forrest? Why are these statues all over him, all over the South? I mean, yeah, he's this kind of, big Confederate cavalry general. Well, after the war, his career continues. Because in 1867, the Ku Klux Klan, this newly founded white supremacist terrorist organization, they meet in Nashville to elect their first Grand Wizard. Who do they pick? Nathan Bedford Forrest.
When was the Ku Klux Klan formed? What year?
In 1866. That's really
so
when
the year after the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly. In Tennessee as well. And so he's symbolically elected their first Grand Wizard, their first leader. Right, so this is a guy. He's a slave trader. He's a Confederate, butcher. If you look at Fort Pillow, to be sure, and then he's the leader of the first leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow!
Listen to this. Until 2020, the state of Tennessee, the governor of the state of Tennessee, was required to pronounce that his birthday was Nathan Bedford Forrest Day. Which means that the first 7 years that I lived in Tennessee until 2020, there would be a Nathan Bedford Forrest Day that people would be
on his birthday.
Would be that the state was meant to celebrate this dude until literally 4 years ago, right? His bust was in the Tennessee Capitol in Nashville, like formally there. Wow. What message do you think that sends to anybody about what the state was championing?
That's wild.
Yeah.
And is this something that just nobody talked about? Because I'm sure if you had a conversation,
people talked about it.
Oh, really?
Well, African Americans had been pushing to remove this guy and to end his holiday forever, right? They're like, this is an insult. Like Tennessee has a large black community, like any southern state, like any American state, but especially so in the South. So they've been fighting from the beginning to get rid of this stuff.
And what was the pushback?
Oh, this is heritage, not hate. Right? It's like this old debate about the Confederate battle flag. I mean, Mississippi only removed the Confederate battle flag from its state flag like 2 years ago or something, like in the midst of Black Lives Matter. That's how long it took for them to get rid of that thing. So there's, these myths die hard. They dig down deep. The lost cause, this sort of, alternate explanation of the Civil War, it would have a powerful reverberations. But it's really important that we extricate that stuff, right? Like, we can't let that stuff haunt our society. I mean, we didn't be aware of it, but to celebrate Nathan Bedford Forrest.
To have a national day about Nathan Bedford Forrest, a guy who just slaughtered a bunch of black people because they were fighting them in a war, is ridiculous.